I'm Maya Whitfield, 27, and the night it happened, the whole house smelled like roast chicken and lemon, the kind of scent that usually means comfort. The table was set with the chipped blue plates we'd had since I was a kid, and my father's shoulders filled the head of the table like a closed door. My mother moved quietly, setting down a bowl of peas, as if sound alone might set someone off. Brooke balanced her phone against a water glass and took a photo before anyone touched a fork. Kelsey picked a place card she'd made for herself, one I hadn't received. I could feel a change in the air, like when a storm passes and the world holds its breath. My name hovered on my father's tongue, heavy, deliberate. Before the first bite cooled, I understood this would be the last dinner that felt familiar, even if familiarity had never truly meant warmth. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand up for your own worth, tap like and subscribe so more voices like ours find their way to this channel. I grew up in the same small weathered house on a quiet street where the mailman knew everyone's dogs and summer meant lawn chairs under a maple tree. Gerald believed in hard work you can measure with tired feet. Marianne believed in keeping peace even when the cost was invisible. They weren't cruel, not in the ways people gossip about, but our home was a place where attention had a pecking order, and I learned early to keep my needs small. I was the girl who brought home library books by the armful and fixed the family laptop with a tutorial I found at midnight, while my sisters took up space with trophies and announcements, and plans that always seemed to fit the calendar better than mine. None of that felt unusual when you're used to it. It felt like weather you dress for. By high school, I understood two kinds of praise lived in our kitchen, the kind that arrived loud and sparkling for Brooke after a game, and the kind that never quite made it to me. It wasn't jealousy that stung, more the steady reminder that applause had assigned seats. So I found different rooms to breathe in. I saved for a second-hand computer, learned to write code that did exactly what I asked, and discovered a quiet power in work that answered back. Those early jobs were small: an appointment scheduler for a barbershop, an inventory list for a quilting store, but every paycheck felt like a vote of confidence cast by strangers who didn't care whose daughter I was. College opened a wider window. Scholarships covered what they could. Late shifts paid for what they couldn't. That's where I met Evan, who looked at the mess of logic on my screen and said without fanfare, "You've got something." We started building tools for small businesses that couldn't afford big software, and the work taught me how to listen to customers, to broken workflows, to my own instinct when a problem had one more layer. I didn't brag about it at home. I kept driving the old sedan that rattled on the highway and sat at the same table where my wins slid off the edges like condensation from a glass. My parents' values were simple. Earn your keep, don't make a fuss, but somewhere along the way, "don't make a fuss" started to mean "don't be seen." The contrast sharpened as I stepped into rooms where the language was contracts and deadlines, where my ideas paid bills, where my name on a line mattered. Then I'd come back to a house where my chair felt borrowed, where Brooke's college plans got the good scissors and ribbon, while my milestones stayed in a drawer. I told myself it didn't matter, that the work was the point and the rest was noise, but even the steady learned to hear a tone that rings off key. I held on to the parts of home that were still good, a porch that caught the evening light just right, the sound of the dishwasher after dinner, the way my mother folded towels like she was tucking them in. Those details stitched the days together, and I used them like thread to make sense of the distance that grew whenever decisions were made without me. It wasn't a blowout fight that shifted the ground. It was the slow drift of being left out of conversations that shaped the future. I kept my head down, kept building, kept saving for a life that didn't need permission. The afternoon of that last ordinary-looking dinner, I drove home past the hardware store where my father's crew stacked pallets and waved like they always had. The sky was clear, the kind that makes you think nothing surprising can happen under it. Inside, my mother asked if I could set the salt and pepper, and Brooke joked about needing extra carbs after practice. I knew my place at the table, and I took it. My father cleared his throat once, then again, and the second sound carried weight the way a judge might lift a hand before speaking. I didn't know the words yet, only that they were loaded and final, that something planned had been waiting for this exact moment. My name came first, as if it needed to be moved out of the way before the real message could land. The fork I lifted felt heavier than it should, and my palms were suddenly too warm. The room seemed to look back at me, familiar walls, measuring what would be said against all the years that came before. And then his voice settled on the table, like a stamp on a document, and the last gentle thing about that night disappeared. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. My father didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. "You've got 1 month to find a new place," he said, setting his fork down beside his plate. "We sold the house." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. The scrape of silverware stopped the clock over the stove ticked louder, and I felt the air leave the room in one heavy sweep. My hand froze halfway to my mouth, the edge of a dinner roll crumbling between my fingers. Brooke's eyes met Kelsey's across the table, a small, quick look that wasn't confusion, it was amusement. My mother kept her gaze low, rolling peas around her plate, as if she hadn't just watched my life rearrange itself in front of her. I tried to speak, but the words came out softer than I meant. "What?" My father leaned back, arms crossed. "You heard me. The house is sold. We close next month." I looked between them, searching for any sign that this was a misunderstanding, some cruel joke that had gone too far. "When did you decide this?" "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Gerald's expression didn't change. "We don't owe you an explanation," he said. "You've been living here for free long enough. Time to grow up. The new owners will deal with you if you're still here by then." His tone was flat, final, and rehearsed. I turned toward my mother, hoping for something, anything, but she just pressed her lips together, her shoulders rigid. The sound that filled the silence came from Brooke, low and mocking. "Guess you'll be sleeping under a bridge soon," she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Kelsey burst into laughter, covering her mouth with her hand. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "This isn't funny," I said quietly, but my voice wavered. My father sighed, that long, deliberate sound that used to follow me down hallways when I was a teenager. "Tears won't help you now," he said. "Maybe if you'd worked harder or contributed something, we wouldn't be here. You've been nothing but a burden, Maya." The word hit harder than I expected. Burden. Like I was some extra weight they'd been waiting to drop. I didn't move for a while after that. The others went back to eating, filling the air with casual talk about moving dates boxes and the new neighborhood they were excited to explore. My name never came up again. Brooke chatted about her college semester. Kelsey showed Mom a photo on her phone, both of them smiling like nothing had happened. I sat there invisible, the sound of forks and plates somehow louder than my thoughts. When dinner ended, I stood up and excused myself, mumbling something about needing rest. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, waiting for the quiet to settle. My hands trembled not from sadness, but from the shock of how quickly they'd erased me. I looked around at the walls I'd painted myself, the shelves I'd built from scrap wood, the desk where I'd spent nights building lines of code that now paid my rent, my bills, and then some. To them, none of that mattered. They'd already decided who I was and what I was worth. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the carpet until my breathing slowed. Somewhere under the disbelief, a strange calm started to form. When I finally pulled out my laptop later that night, I saw the email that would shift everything. It had been sitting there for 2 days, an automated alert from a real estate site I barely remembered signing up for. The headline read, "New listing 4 and 15, Willow Glen Road." My stomach dropped. That was our address. I clicked before I could think. Photos filled the screen, the front porch, the living room, the kitchen. Even my bedroom clothes still draped over the chair by the window. My posters, my books, my life displayed in high resolution for strangers to scroll through. They hadn't even mentioned they were selling, hadn't warned me to pack, hadn't cared enough to keep it private. For a moment I just stared at the listing, my pulse quick and shallow. Then a thought slipped through, sharp and impossible. I grabbed my phone and called Evan. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, you sound wired." "What's up?" he said. I laughed once under my breath, the kind of laugh that carries too much disbelief. "You're not going to believe this," I said. "My parents listed the house, the one I'm living in." He paused. "Wait, what? They didn't tell you?" "Nope. But I've got an idea." There was silence on the line. "Oh no," he said slowly. What kind of idea? The kind that makes sure they'll never know who they're selling to, I said. I'm buying it. He let out a low whistle. You serious? Completely, I said. Through the company. Everything goes through our LLC. It'll look like any other buyer. Over the next week, every spare hour was swallowed by paperwork and phone calls. I met with a discreet agent, a woman named Karen Leary, who specialized in private acquisitions. Her only question was whether I wanted to remain anonymous through closing. Absolutely, I said. She nodded like she'd heard that before. We drafted the offer just above asking price enough to make sure my father accepted without haggling. Every time I signed my name, my hand shook not from fear, but from the thrill of what it meant. They thought they'd beaten me, and here I was, buying the ground out from under them. At home, I played the role of the clueless daughter perfectly. I asked my mother if she needed help packing, listened, while my father talked about property taxes in the new neighborhood, and smiled when Brooke joked about turning my room into a guest suite. Inside, I kept my secret sealed tight. Some nights I could hear my parents talking through the wall. This will be good for her, Mom whispered. She'll have to grow up now. Dad chuckled, his voice low. About time. She's been freeloading long enough. I pressed my pillow against my mouth to hide the sound of my laughter. The deal was already halfway through escrow. The following week, my father mentioned the new buyers at dinner. Nice couple, he said between bites. They were eager to move fast. I had to set my fork down before I gave myself away. Really, I asked lightly. Must be excited to start fresh. Brooke smirked. Meanwhile, you'll be fighting for rent somewhere, she said. Hope your coding thing covers it. I smiled back, my face steady. We'll see, I said. When the day came to finalize the sale, I met Evan outside the attorney's office. He was grinning like a kid about to pull the best prank of his life. You sure about this? He asked. I nodded. Completely. Inside, I signed the last of the paperwork. The stack felt heavier than any contract I'd handled before. Then the notary stamped the final page, and just like that, the house I'd grown up in, the one they'd used to cast me out, was mine. That evening when I pulled into the driveway, the front yard was a maze of boxes and movers. My father was giving directions. Mom was double-checking labels, Brooke was arguing with a driver, and Kelsey was glued to her phone. They barely looked up when I walked past. You've got 1 month, Dad said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Better start looking for an apartment. I nodded. Right. I'll figure something out. Brooke grinned. Good luck with that. When their car finally backed down the driveway, I stood in the doorway watching the taillights fade. The house was silent for the first time in years, not empty but calm, like it was exhaling with me. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the door frames, the corners where my childhood lingered. It felt strange and clean and entirely mine. I called Evan that night. They're gone, I said. He laughed through the receiver. So Miss Whitfield, landlord or homeowner? I smiled, looking around the space that no longer belonged to anyone else. Both, I said. The weeks that followed were a kind of quiet I'd never known. I worked, furnished the rooms, and let the stillness become part of my routine. The laughter and tension that had once filled every hallway were gone, replaced by music, coffee brewing, and the sound of my own breathing. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like freedom slowly taking root. But freedom never stays hidden for long. 6 months later, a message buzzed on my phone, 4 words that made me stop mid-step. Why are you still there? My father's number glowed on the screen. I looked around the room, the sunlight spilling across the floor, and smiled. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. My father's message stayed on my phone for hours before I answered it. 4 words. Why are you still there? The tone was cold. Even in text, the kind of short-clipped phrasing he used when he was irritated, but trying to sound in control. I didn't reply. I just set the phone down on the kitchen counter and let the silence stretch. By the time evening fell, I'd almost forgotten about it, until a car door slammed outside. When I peeked through the window, I saw them. My parents, Brooke and Kelsey, stepping out of the same dark SUV they'd left in months ago. They stood in the driveway like strangers who'd taken a wrong turn, staring up at the house as if it had changed languages while they were gone. My father's hands went to his hips. My mother's purse hung from her arm, still zipped but trembling slightly. I didn't move right away. I let them stand there until the porch light clicked on automatically. Then I opened the front door and said as evenly as I could, "Come in." They hesitated, then stepped inside. The entryway looked different now, brighter, simpler, and filled with the faint scent of cedar from the new floors. Brooke's eyes darted from the framed art to the polished furniture. "Wow," she murmured. "This looks really different." Kelsey ran a finger along the smooth surface of the console table and whispered, "Who even lives like this?" My father didn't say anything, but I could see the confusion pulling at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't used to not knowing something. My mother finally broke the silence. "Maya, where did you get the money for all this? Who owns this house now?" Her voice sounded more demanding than curious. I gestured toward the couch. "You can sit," I said. They didn't. I took a seat instead and folded one leg over the other. "I own it," I said quietly. "The company bought it 6 months ago." The words seemed to fall between us and scatter. My mother blinked. Brooke let out a small, incredulous laugh. My father frowned so deeply it changed the shape of his face. "That's not possible," he said. "You don't have that kind of money." I met his stare. "I do. Evan and I sold our software last year. The house was listed under a shell company we own. The sale closed before you left." The color drained from my mother's cheeks. She gripped the edge of the armchair as if the floor had shifted under her feet. "You're saying you bought the house," I finished for her. "Yes." The first sound that followed was Brooke's nervous laugh. "That's insane," she said, shaking her head. You bought it." Kelsey smirked, but even she looked unsure. My father cleared his throat, searching for his usual authority. "If you're doing well, good for you," he said, his tone softening just enough to sound strategic. "But this place has history. You can't just—" "It's mine now," I said, cutting him off. "Legally and completely." The room went still again. My mother's voice turned small the way it did when she wanted something. "Maya, we've had some financial setbacks," she began. "The new house was more expensive than we planned. Brooke's tuition, Kelsey's dorm. Everything's adding up." My father nodded, picking up where she left off. "Your mother's right. You're in a good place now. Maybe you can help out. Family takes care of family." The irony almost made me laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I stood and faced them. "You sold this house out from under me," I said. "You laughed when I asked what I was supposed to do. You told me I was a burden. Now you're standing in my living room, asking for help." Brooke's eyes dropped to the rug. Kelsey's expression flickered from defiance to discomfort. My mother reached out her hand, trembling. "We made mistakes," she said softly. "We didn't know how much you'd grown. We just want to make things right." I shook my head. "You didn't want to make things right. You wanted control. You still do." My father stepped forward, his voice rising. "Watch your tone, Maya. I'm still your father." The words hit the air like a gavel, but they didn't land the way they used to. "I know who you are," I said, "and I know what you did. That doesn't make you right." He started to speak again, but my mother caught his arm. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy. "Please," she whispered, "can we sit down and talk?" For a moment I almost let her. Then the sound of Kelsey's phone buzzing broke the spell. She turned away, muttering under her breath. "This is ridiculous." The sharpness of it brought everything back into focus. I pointed toward the door. "You should go." My father straightened his jaw, tightening. "You're serious?" "Completely," I said. "I've lived in your silence long enough. You don't get to fill it again just because it's convenient." My mother started crying, then the quiet kind that made her shoulders shake without sound. Brooke moved to her side, murmuring that it would be fine, but her own eyes were red. My father stood still, his pride caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. "You can't just shut us out," he said. "We're your family." I opened the front door. The night air was cool still, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier. "You stopped being my family when you decided I wasn't worth keeping," I said. They didn't argue after that. One by one, they stepped outside. My mother was the last to turn around. Her tears had left thin streaks down her cheeks. "We'll find a way back," she said quietly. "You'll see." I met her gaze, steady and calm. "No," I said. "You won't." Then I closed the door and locked it. For a long while I stayed by the window, watching their car headlights disappear down the street. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt whole. I walked through the rooms, touching the edges of furniture I'd chosen, hearing the faint echo of my own footsteps. Mrs. Dwyer from next door noticed the light still on and called over the fence the next morning. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "It is now," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. My phone buzzed constantly, at first calls from my parents, messages from Brooke, long paragraphs from Kelsey that swung between apology and blame. I didn't answer any of them. After a week, the messages slowed. After a month, they stopped. The silence they'd once forced on me had finally become my own choice. Sometimes I caught myself standing in the doorway of the living room at dusk, the light fading the same way it did that night at dinner months before. But now the space looked different. The walls weren't closing in anymore. They were open. The house no longer felt like something I had to escape. It felt like a place I'd earned one signature at a time. And yet, as peaceful as it was, a small unease lingered. Freedom has a way of shining a light on what's still unresolved. I could feel something else coming, a different kind of reckoning. I didn't know when or how, but I knew this story between us wasn't finished, not yet. It took weeks for the quiet to settle into something comfortable. After that confrontation, I threw myself into work. Evan and I were building a new version of our platform, cleaner, smarter, scalable enough to attract bigger clients. The office we rented downtown was small but bright, its windows overlooking a stretch of coffee shops and food trucks. We spent long hours coding side by side, surviving on caffeine and determination. It wasn't glamorous, but every finished line of code felt like progress. Every small success proved that the choices I'd made had been the right ones. At night, the house no longer felt haunted by memory. I kept the rooms uncluttered, simple, and full of light. The furniture was new, but chosen with care, sofa fabrics that felt soft instead of showy colors that calmed instead of impressed. The smell of fresh paint and polished wood replaced the echoes of slammed doors. I still caught myself pausing in doorways, sometimes half expecting to hear my father's voice or my sister's laughter, but only silence answered back. That silence became a kind of peace I hadn't known before. Business grew faster than either of us expected. A manufacturing firm signed a contract, then another followed. By spring, we were hiring 2 more programmers. Evan handled the interviews while I reviewed portfolios and wrote proposals late into the night. We talked about expanding to another city, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't in a hurry to leave anywhere. This house, once a reminder of everything I'd endured, had become the anchor I'd needed all along. 6 months after my parents showed up at the door, I started receiving calls from unfamiliar numbers. At first, I ignored them, assuming they were spam or clients we hadn't onboarded yet. But one message stood out. The voice was calm and familiar. "Maya, it's Nora. Call me when you can." My aunt had always been the quiet one at family gatherings, the kind who listened more than she spoke. Hearing her voice stirred something that had been buried under layers of new beginnings. When I called back, she didn't waste time with small talk. "I know you don't want to hear from them," she said softly, "but they've been trying to reach you through me. Your mother asked me to speak with you." I leaned against the counterphone pressed to my ear. "About what I asked." "They regret how things turned out," she said. "Your dad's been having a hard time at work. They thought if I reached out, maybe you'd be willing to talk." For a long moment, I said nothing. I could picture my mother pacing my father, sitting silent in his chair, both of them waiting for someone else to do their mending. Aunt Nora filled the pause. "You don't have to forgive them," she said gently. "But don't carry their mistakes forever either. Sometimes forgiveness is just letting go of the noise." Her tone wasn't pushy, just kind, steady the way she'd always been. I thanked her for calling, promised I'd think about it, and hung up. That evening, I stood by the kitchen window, watching the rain bead against the glass. The house felt warm and steady around me, but her words stayed. I thought about how many times I'd looked to these same walls for approval, how many nights I'd worked quietly just to prove I deserved a place inside them. I realized that the proof was no longer necessary. I wasn't waiting for anyone to see my worth. I had already built a life that showed it. The next day, Evan noticed my distraction. "You're somewhere else," he said, setting down his coffee. "What's going on?" I told him about Aunt Nora's call. He nodded slowly. "You going to talk to them?" I shook my head. "I don't think so. There's nothing left to say." He looked thoughtful. "Maybe not for them, but maybe for you." His words were simple without pressure, but they lingered. That weekend I visited the small park where I used to walk after work in college. The trees had grown taller since then, their leaves stretching wide over the old walking path. Children played near the swings, their laughter mixing with the sound of a distant fountain. I sat on a bench, hands folded in my lap, and realized how much of my life had been shaped by trying to earn peace from people who didn't know how to give it. Peace wasn't a gift, it was something I had learned to make for myself. Later that night, I opened the old family photo box I'd tucked away in the hall closet. Inside were birthdays, vacations, awkward school pictures. There was a photo of me at 12, sitting cross-legged in front of a half-built computer, a tangle of wires in my hands. I remembered how proud I'd been when it finally powered on, how my father had nodded once before turning back to the TV. I slipped that photo into a small frame and placed it on my desk. Not as a reminder of what I lacked back then, but of how far I'd come since. In the following weeks, work picked up speed. We secured a major contract with a national logistics company, one that would double our revenue within the year. Evan insisted on celebrating. He brought champagne and pizza to the office, and we toasted to the new chapter. I smiled, feeling the weight of something shifting, not just success, but closure, taking shape in its own quiet way. That night I walked through the house one last time before bed, checking locks, turning off lights, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator. In the living room, the reflection from the streetlight cast a pale glow on the framed photo. The girl in it looked certain of her future even back then, I whispered. We made it. And for the first time, I felt like both parts of me, the girl who once sat invisible at her family's table, and the woman who owned this home, had finally met in the middle. The next morning brought a letter slipped through the front gate. No return address, just my name in my mother's handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note. "We hope you're doing well. Your father misses you. Please call when you're ready." No apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done, just the same quiet plea for attention that had always followed every silence. I folded the letter and set it aside. When Evan called later that day to discuss the next round of funding, I told him I'd be taking a few days off. "Good," he said. "You've earned it." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Yeah," I said. "I think I finally have." That night the rain came again, tapping gently against the windows. I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, the room lit only by the soft glow of the lamp. The house was quiet, but this time it wasn't an echo of loneliness. It was a sound of peace. I didn't know if my family would ever truly understand what they'd lost. But I did know one thing: I had stopped needing them to. As I set the cup down and turned off the lamp, a strange calm washed over me. Life was moving forward in ways I couldn't have imagined a year ago. Still deep down, I sensed that something unresolved was waiting just beyond the horizon, something that would test how much peace I'd really found. Spring turned to early summer before the next change came. Our company had just signed a contract with a national retail distributor, one that promised enough revenue to double our team. Evan handled most of the technical onboarding while I focused on building partnerships. The long nights of coding and caffeine had turned into steady mornings filled with video calls, proposals, and check-ins. Every milestone carried a quiet satisfaction that words couldn't quite capture. The house felt different now. I had filled the empty rooms with the kind of life that once felt out of reach. Plants by the windows, music drifting through the hallways, the smell of fresh coffee each morning. It wasn't about luxury. It was about finally having peace. Sometimes I caught myself pausing at the top of the stairs, listening to nothing but my own footsteps, realizing that silence could be comforting instead of cold. Work gave my days structure, but it was the evenings that gave them meaning. I started hosting small dinners for the team, Evan, the 2 new developers, and occasionally a designer from another company who'd become a friend. We'd eat laugh talk about ideas and ambitions and end the night with empty plates and a sense that life had finally turned a corner. For the first time, my home wasn't a symbol of what I'd lost. It was a space I'd chosen. One Thursday afternoon, as I was finalizing a report, a knock echoed through the hallway. When I opened the door, I saw Mrs. Dwyer standing there holding a basket of lemons from her backyard tree. She smiled warmly. "You've really turned this place around," she said. "It looks happier now." I thanked her and she nodded toward the street. "Your folks drove by a few days ago," she added softly. "Didn't stop, but they looked long enough to mean something." Her words lingered long after she left. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of tea watching the streetlights blink on. The idea of them circling the block, seeing the lights in my windows, stirred a quiet unease I couldn't quite shake. I didn't know if it was guilt or simply the echo of old habits, the part of me that had spent years wanting their approval, even when I knew it would never come. The next morning I found an envelope tucked under the doormat. My name was written in my father's sharp, familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note. "We shouldn't have left things the way we did. If you're willing to talk, call us." There was a phone number beneath it, even though his was still saved in my phone. I read it twice before setting it aside on the counter. By the time evening came, I had decided not to respond. Some things didn't need reopening. A few days later, Evan called from the office. "You free this weekend?" he asked. "Thought we could go over the expansion plan, maybe celebrate a little too." I agreed. It felt good to have plans that didn't circle around the past. But when Saturday arrived, a different message appeared on my phone, this time from Brooke. "Please, Maya, Dad's not well. Can we come by?" I stared at the screen, unsure if it was true or another attempt to pull me back in. The silence stretched so long that the message dimmed and disappeared. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but something deeper, a reflex older than logic, made me text back. "Tomorrow at 2. Sunday afternoon was warm, the kind of golden weather that made the air hum with life. Their car pulled into the driveway right on time. My mother stepped out first, wearing the same beige coat she'd worn the day she left this house. Brooke followed her, expression hesitant. Kelsey wasn't there. My father moved slower than I remembered his face, pale and drawn. "Thank you for letting us come," my mother said as I opened the door. I nodded and stepped aside. They entered carefully like guests in a museum, their eyes catching on the small changes, the photographs, the bookshelves, the bright rug in the hallway. My father sat down on the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. He spoke first. "I had a health scare last month," he said quietly. "Heart trouble. Doctor says I need to slow down." His voice sounded thin, smaller than I'd ever heard it. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My mother's hand rested on his arm, and she added, "He's been thinking about what happened, about everything. We both have." I stood by the window, my arms folded loosely. "Why now?" I asked. My father looked up. "Because I realized how wrong we were," he said. "You didn't deserve what we did. You were never the problem, Maya. We were." The words landed somewhere between apology and exhaustion. I wanted to believe them, but they felt like echoes arriving too late. My mother's eyes were red. "We lost ourselves in pride," she said. I kept quiet when I should have spoken. "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled on the last word. I stayed silent for a long moment, then finally said, "I appreciate you saying that." My father nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. "We can't change what we did," he said, "but I hope you'll let us try to make amends." The house felt smaller with them in it, the air thicker somehow. I remembered the nights I'd cried in that same living room, trying to make sense of their indifference. Yet seeing them now, aged fragile, unsure, dulled some of the sharpness I'd carried. Still, forgiveness wasn't something I could hand over like a spare key. "I don't hate you," I said finally, "but I can't go back to how things were. I've built a life that doesn't depend on being understood by you." My father's eyes glistened, though he tried to hide it. "That's fair," he said quietly. Just don't shut the door completely." They stayed for less than an hour. When they left, my mother hugged me awkwardly like someone remembering how to hold on and whispered, "We love you always." I didn't answer, but I didn't pull away either. After the sound of their car faded down the street, I sat on the front steps for a while, the sunlight slipping behind the trees. It felt like something had shifted, not reconciliation, but release. The anger that once burned hot had cooled into something steadier, something closer to acceptance. Later that evening, Evan called to check in. "You sound different," he said. "What happened?" I told him about the visit, about the apology that came years too late. He was quiet for a moment. "You did what you needed to," he said. "That's all that matters." When I hung up, I walked through the house again, the way I always did, when my mind needed grounding. The walls seemed to breathe with the same calm rhythm they always had. In the quiet, I could almost hear my younger self whispering from some faraway memory, "You're finally home." The next morning, a soft breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from Mrs. Dwyer's garden. I stood by the sink, coffee in hand, and watched the light spread across the floor. I didn't know if my family would ever truly change, but I knew I had. And though peace had finally found me, I sensed another test was coming, a moment that would show whether this new strength I'd built could hold when the past tried to return again. The morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter, touching the silver coffee pot and the stack of folders waiting to be reviewed. 6 months had passed since my parents' visit, and life had settled into a steady rhythm again. The business was growing faster than I'd imagined. Evan and I had just signed a major contract with a nationwide logistics firm, and a small article about our company's growth had started circulating online. It wasn't front-page news, but it was enough to catch attention. That's how I met Lena Torres, a journalist from a regional business magazine. She reached out through email asking for a feature on women entrepreneurs in tech. Her tone was warm and professional, her questions thoughtful. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I wanted my story told publicly, but something about her persistence felt genuine. We met at a cafe downtown, a quiet place with old brick walls and soft music that made conversation easy. She arrived early, notebook already open, coffee untouched. "Maya, thank you for meeting me," she said, shaking my hand. "Your company's growth is impressive. But what caught my eye was how you built it from almost nothing." I smiled. "We just kept going when things didn't make sense," I said. "That's the whole secret." She laughed, then asked, "Would you mind sharing a bit about where you started?" The interview flowed naturally. I spoke about long nights in college, about how Evan and I took small programming jobs just to pay tuition. I mentioned the early struggles, glitches, rejections, the feeling that nobody saw what we were building until it worked. But I avoided talking about my family. That part still felt too raw, too tangled with memories I wasn't ready to see in print. When the article came out 2 weeks later, it focused on resilience and innovation. My photo filled half the page, taken in my home office beside the same window that once overlooked my parents' car in the driveway. The headline read, "From Small-Town Code to National Reach, the Quiet Power of Maya Whitfield." It was simple, respectful, and suddenly everywhere. Emails started flooding in. Old classmates congratulated me. Local news stations requested short segments. Even my alma mater invited me to speak at a tech panel for young women. It was overwhelming and exciting all at once. Evan teased that I'd become the face of the company, but behind his grin was pride. Then one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message I didn't expect. It was from Kelsey. Just 3 words, Mom saw it. I stared at the screen, unsure what to do. A minute later, another message followed. "They're proud of you. They want to talk." That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the light fade over the street. Mrs. Dwyer waved as she watered her hydrangeas, and I waved back, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I could almost picture my parents' living room, Marianne holding the magazine Gerald, pretending to skim it while secretly reading every word. I wondered what it felt like for them to see my name there, my story in print. No longer the daughter they dismissed, but a woman who had built something without their help. The next morning, there was another envelope under my door. This one was heavier, written in my mother's neat handwriting. Inside was a short note. "We're sorry for how things went. We're proud of you. If you're open to it, we'd love to see you. Folded beneath it was the magazine article marked with a yellow highlight around the sentence, "Success didn't make her stronger. It revealed the strength that was already there." I read it twice, then set it on the counter beside my coffee. I didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or simply breathe. When I told Evan about it later that day, he listened quietly. "You don't have to answer right away," he said. "But maybe this is the moment you decide how much space they get in your life." I nodded. Maybe. A week passed before I replied. I wrote a short message. No anger, no resentment, just clarity. "I'm glad you're doing well. I'm grateful for the support, but I need time." I hit send and felt something lift from my chest. Days turned into weeks. The story kept spreading. A few investors reached out, and suddenly we were fielding offers to expand into 3 more states. My calendar filled with interviews, podcasts, and client meetings. But in the quiet moments after the calls ended and the house grew still again, I found myself thinking about that letter, about how pride and regret can live side by side in a person's heart. One afternoon, Lena called again. "We're doing a follow-up piece," she said, "a short video segment. Would you be open to filming at your home? Something personal, nothing intrusive." I hesitated, but she added, "We'll focus on your story, your space, your journey." I agreed. A small crew arrived the next week, just a cameraman, a producer, and Lena with her calm, patient questions. They filmed in my living room, the soft light catching the shelves and the framed photograph of 12-year-old me beside my first computer. At one point, she asked quietly, "Do you think your family understands now?" I paused, unsure how to answer. "I think they're trying," I said, "and maybe that's enough." The video went live 2 weeks later. The response was overwhelming messages from young women who saw themselves in my story, from small business owners who'd felt invisible until something clicked. But buried among the notifications was one email that stopped me cold. It was from Brooke. "I watched the video. I never realized how much you carried alone. I'm sorry for all the ways I made that worse. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." It wasn't long or dramatic, but it was sincere. I replied simply, "Thank you, Brooke. That means a lot." She answered within minutes. "Maybe we can meet next time I'm home. Just coffee. No pressure." The day after that exchange, I walked through the house, noticing how different it felt again. The rooms were still but softer somehow, as if the walls themselves had let go of something heavy. I thought of the years I'd spent waiting for acknowledgement that might never come, only to realize it was finding its way to me after all. Later that night, Evan and I stayed late at the office finalizing documents for the next expansion. As we left, he said, "You know, it's funny. Success changes everyone around you more than it changes you." I smiled faintly. Maybe it just makes people finally see what was there all along. When I got home, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a soft glow across the walkway. The house stood quiet and sure, the same way I felt inside. I knew there was still distance between my family and me, still parts of the story that hadn't been spoken aloud. But something had shifted. The anger had lost its edge. What remained was a steadier kind of strength, one that didn't need validation to stand tall. And though I didn't know what would come next, I could sense that the next step wasn't about revenge or even forgiveness. It was about freedom, the kind that comes when the past finally stops defining the shape of your life. By late summer, the air turned heavy with heat, the kind that slowed everything down except the thoughts that wouldn't quiet. The business was thriving, 3 new contracts in progress, a small downtown office buzzing with energy, and a sense of momentum I could finally trust. Yet beneath it all, a quiet tension kept finding me. My parents hadn't reached out again since the letter, but every so often I caught myself glancing at my phone, wondering if silence was the real closure or just another kind of waiting. The answer came on an ordinary Friday afternoon. Evan and I were reviewing projections when my phone lit up with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something habit or intuition made me pick up. "Maya Whitfield," a woman's voice asked. "This is Lena Torres. I'm so sorry to call out of the blue, but something came across my desk you should know about." Her tone was careful, professional, but concerned. She explained that another magazine was preparing a follow-up story, except this one wasn't about the company's growth. Someone had reached out to them claiming to be a family source, suggesting the article had left out important truths. My stomach tightened. Who, I asked. Lena hesitated. They didn't name themselves directly, but the contact email traces back to your sister's campus account. I didn't speak for several seconds. Lena went on. They shared photos of your old house, old family gatherings, even some comments implying you weren't the real founder, that your partner handled everything while you used family money to get started. I let out a slow breath. That's not true, I said quietly. I know, she replied. I told the editor it sounded personal, but I wanted you to be aware before they print anything. After we hung up, the silence in the office felt heavier than usual. Evan looked up from his laptop. Bad news, he asked. I told him what had happened, keeping my voice even. He frowned. Kelsey, I nodded. Seems like it. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. We can get ahead of it. Facts are on our side. Still, what do you want to do? That night, I couldn't focus on anything. The lights in the living room glowed soft against the windows, but the peace I'd built felt fragile again. Every word of Lena's call replayed in my mind, the bitterness behind Kelsey's name, the effort it must have taken to twist what she knew. By morning, I decided to call her. The number rang 4 times before she answered. Maya. Her voice was tentative. I didn't waste time. I know what you did, I said. The story, the photos, the messages you sent them. There was a pause, then a shaky sigh. I didn't mean for it to go that far, she said. They reached out to me. I just told them what I thought they already knew. What you thought they knew, I repeated. That I stole my own success, that I used money from a family that barely acknowledged me. Kelsey's tone hardened. You don't get it. Everyone's been talking since that article came out. Mom's friends, Dad's old co-workers, they all say you made us look bad, like we were villains. I swallowed the first response that came to mind. You made yourselves look that way, I said quietly. I didn't write fiction. I built a life. She didn't reply. Only her breathing filled the line. Kelsey, I added, you could have called me. Instead, you tried to ruin me. Her voice cracked. I was jealous. Okay, you get all this attention now, and they just sit there talking about you like you're some kind of hero. I couldn't take it. The admission hung between us, raw and unsteady. I closed my eyes, forcing my voice to stay calm. You think any of this came easy? I asked. You think success erases what they did? She didn't answer. Finally, she said, I'm sorry, barely above a whisper. I ended the call with a simple, take care of yourself, and set the phone down. The following week, Lena called again. The editor dropped the story, she said. Apparently the source recanted. I thanked her, but my gratitude carried a weight I couldn't quite shake. Some betrayals don't hit like explosions. They settle quietly, showing you how deep the cracks go. Evan noticed the change in me over the next few days. You're quieter, he said one evening as we locked up the office. You want to talk about it? I gave a small nod. We walked a few blocks to a late-night diner, the kind with neon signs and chipped mugs that never ran out of coffee. I told him everything about Kelsey, the jealousy, the apology that wasn't really won. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, you know, people who try to drag you down usually do it because they think you've already left them behind. I looked out the window at the dark street. Maybe I have, I said softly. The next morning, a delivery arrived at the house. It was a small box, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, me, Brooke, and Kelsey at a fair when we were kids. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but across the back, someone had written in blue ink, "We were still sisters once." No signature. I set the photo on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. So much of my life had been about survival, about proving I could stand without their approval. But that picture, those faces belonged to a time before all the hurt began. I didn't frame it. I didn't throw it away either. I left it where it landed, a quiet reminder that even broken ties start somewhere whole. That evening I sat on the porch with a cup of tea as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air smelled faintly of rain. Across the street, Mrs. Dwyer waved as she pulled her trash bin to the curb. "Evening, dear," she called. You've been keeping busy." I smiled. "Trying to." She tilted her head. "Looks like life's turning out better than it started." I thought about that for a moment before answering. "It is," I said. "Just took a few storms to see the view." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from understanding more than words can say. Later inside, I opened my laptop and sent a single email to my team. "We're ready for the next phase. Let's make it count." When I hit send, a calm certainty settled over me. I had weathered the lies, the silence, the guilt, and somehow what stood on the other side of it wasn't anger. It was peace, earned through truth. Still, as the house quieted and the night stretched long, I felt one thought lingering. The story with my family wasn't over, not completely. There was one more door to close, one final choice to make before I could truly step into the life I'd built. And deep down, I knew that choice was coming soon. The night after the email went out to my team, the house stayed unusually quiet. I sat in my office with the window open, listening to the soft hum of crickets outside and the faint rhythm of passing cars. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It just felt earned. Everything that needed to be said to my family, to the world, even to myself, had finally been spoken. The following morning, sunlight filled the kitchen. I brewed a pot of coffee, then noticed the photograph still sitting on the table, the one Kelsey had sent in that unmarked box. The three of us stood there frozen in childhood smiles, wide and unguarded. For a long while, I just looked at it. That picture no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a chapter, one that had already ended. A few weeks later, Evan and I stood outside our new office building, a renovated warehouse with tall windows and clean lines. The company had outgrown our old space, and we were finally moving into something that reflected what we'd built. The sign over the door read, "Whitfield and Park Systems," a name Evan had insisted on even when I tried to argue against it. "You've earned it," he told me. "Own it." Inside, the team was buzzing, moving boxes, setting up monitors, laughing about the poor Wi-Fi signal and the smell of fresh paint. I walked through the space slowly, watching the light spill across the desks, and thought about how far those late nights of ramen and code had taken us. It wasn't just a company anymore. It was a life rebuilt from the ground up. Around lunchtime, Evan called me over. "Visitor," he said with a small smile. I turned and saw Brooke standing near the door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure if she belonged there. I met her halfway. "Hey," she said softly. "I was in town for a tournament. Thought maybe I could stop by." I nodded. "I'm glad you did." She hesitated before handing me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, simple, honest, a little shaky. "I know it'll take time, but I want us to be sisters again. If you'll let me." I looked up, and for the first time there wasn't guilt in her eyes, just sincerity. I smiled and said, "One step at a time." She nodded, relieved. Before leaving, she added, "Dad's doing better. Mom said to tell you she's proud of you." I didn't know if that pride came from understanding or from finally seeing what I'd built without them. Either way, it was enough. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind to finish a few last details. The light outside had turned amber, spilling across the rows of empty desks. I stood by the window looking out at the skyline. Somewhere out there, my family was living their own quiet version of moving on. We weren't close again, not yet, but we were no longer standing on opposite sides of pain. When I locked up and drove home, the sky was streaked with shades of lavender and gold. The house waited in its usual calm, the same one I'd fought to reclaim. I walked through the door, set down my keys, and for a moment simply stood there listening to the quiet hum of the air, the faint creak of floorboards that finally felt like they belonged to me. Before bed, I took the old photograph and slipped it into a drawer, not hidden, just stored. I didn't need to look at it anymore to remember what I'd overcome. Some memories deserve peace, not constant revisiting. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized the story I'd been living wasn't really about revenge or triumph. It was about rebuilding worth when the people who should have protected it tried to take it away. About proving that dignity isn't something anyone can grant, It's something you decide to keep even when no one else sees it. People like to say forgiveness is for the other person. But standing there in the dark, I knew it was for me, for the girl who once sat at that family table small and unseen, dreaming of a different life. I had given her that life. And now as I start each day walking into a company that carries my name, I think less about what was lost and more about what grew in its place. Love without strings, work that matters, peace that doesn't need witnesses. If you've ever had to fight for your own place in the world, I hope you know this. You don't owe anyone your silence to keep the peace. You can build something strong and kind from what they tried to break. Thanks for listening to my story. And if it touched something familiar in you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. Sometimes all it takes is hearing one quiet truth you're allowed to start again, and you're allowed to finish free.